So I'm traveling right now, which means I'm trying to stay away from the news, but I can't help but follow the trial of the would-be murderer of Salman Rushdie. His book, Midnight's Children, is my favorite of all time. So some of you may not know that Salman Rushdie is an Indian author who lived most of his life in England, now lives in the United States, and he had a fatwa put against him by the country of Iran based on, I think it was his fifth or sixth novel called The Satanic Verses, which he does not want to define him. It was one of his earlier works. And what this fatwa called for, I think it was the Ayatollah who issued it, was for somebody to murder Salman Rushdie on behalf of Islam. And someone tried, eventually. So Salman lived in total isolation, like secluded in the UK for over a decade. And then for the last 20 years, he's been venturing out and actually having a life. And that's changed. A lot of the reason is because his attacker has taken the vision in his right eye and a lot of the function in his left hand, as well as caused a tremendous amount of internal damage because he stabbed him 15 times, which weirdly he now denies because he did it in a crowded amphitheater and people in the audience took him down. So I'm sorry, this is some pretty triggering content, but I wanted to talk about this because I'm actually reading his memoir called Knife, and it's really his story about what it is that happened. And it's one of the reasons the trial was postponed is because this memoir was coming out, and I happened to be reading it this week, and I'm guessing that's why the library put it on one of those quick holds, because the trial was happening and people wanted to read it. And it is amazing how Salman Rushdie is doing his own therapy. So there's so much that's important in this book, but I just want to describe what he talks about when he sits down in his imagination with his would-be attacker, who he calls A. He says, I have to imagine a way into his head. And he sets these scenes where he sits down and he talks to him, and in these conversations, Salman Rushdie pokes hole in this accuser's, this would-be murderer's argument, and talks about, you called me disingenuous, who else might that be? And when you say everybody hates me, like, how is it you're talking about that? He's so insightful and witty and poignant, but really doesn't allow him to accept any of the arguments that this young man would have made. He even calls him an incel, which he probably was. At one point he says, it's not over until my head says it is. And this to me was such a classic way of taking back agency and control. So in my head, as I'm reading this, I'm like, this is how we use PTSD processing, is we recreate an imaginary scene where you get to tell the truth of what happened, the truth of what should have happened. You get to create an alternate reality. You do that while you're in a calm body, and you gain your sense of agency back. And then you repeat that scene over and over until it feels more true, that you are more in control, that you are more calm, and that something within the situation has changed. In this case, he doesn't accept any of the blame or the shame or the intent of why this was being done to him. This is how we heal trauma. So as I'm reading the book, I don't know, like, he hasn't mentioned yet because I'm not quite done it, but he hasn't said if he's had formal therapy yet, but I'm just thinking, this was a narrative practice of you writing out the story of what happened to you, trying to restore a calm body, I'm presuming through all the edits and rewrites, and then eventually coming to this scene where you sit down in your imagination with the accused and say everything that you wanted to say. I'm a bit sad for Salman Rushdie that the maximum sentence for this crime was 25 years, and I'm hoping that federal prosecutors will convict him for terrorism as well. But what an absolute gift to read this memoir with the lens of a trauma therapist and know that he was healing himself through writing. And through that, Salman has already won.